ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the second Oxford Libertarian Society event of Trinity term. Christian Michel dropped out of the University of Sorbonne and then worked his way from the ground up to become an owner of a top financial services company in Europe. In the meantime, he also has written a number of books on liberty and a number of important articles. Among his projects are he is president of the Libertarian International. He is an officer of the very active Libertarian Alliance here in the UK. And he also runs a website called Liberalia, which attempts to, I suppose, keep the classical liberal light alive in the French language. Tonight, Christian Michel is going to talk to us on the very timely topic of democracy, and particularly why he is not a Democrat and why he prefers freedom instead. So, Christian.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you all for attending. I know it's a period of exams and so on, so I'm very grateful that you took time off to listen to what I have to say. But it's always interesting in these introductions is to discover all the things that you have done, should have done, or might have done. And but it's good to be here. I was telling Nick and Colin earlier that I was a dunce at school. I was not at all motivated by studies, and but when I came to Oxford the first time, I regretted not having harder work when I was studying in France, because that would have been a motivation. Had I known what Oxford was, I would have striven for the privilege. So you are the privilege, and I'm here. So that's very good. And yes, when Nick asked me to give a talk, he suggested that I talk about democracy, which is obviously a timely topic. And during the next half hour, I'm going to explain why democracy is the worst system of government without any exception. And by contradicting Churchill's famous saying, I know I'm taking a risk because democratic dogma has become so untouchable. By assailing democracy, one is condemned to excommunication, the heretic cannot be published, there's no access to public forums except maybe in a place like this, and if it is a state, it is considered an outlaw, a pariah amongst nations. The problem with any examination of democracy is that it is defined in multiple ways. And one definition, as you know, is purely procedural in nature. Democracy is a method of governing characterized by elections. In that respect, it is different from other political systems like monarchy, dictatorship, military junta, and anarchy. But democratic is also a buzzword to label everything that pleases us in the news. I mean, democratic describes school reforms we like, cool parents, cheap rents, trade unions that protect us, whilst strict teachers, Catholic Pope, multinationals that lay off employees, are definitely anti-democratic. And such a vague concept allows its proponents to shirk any criticism of democracy. The democratic dogma is taught in every school, it is praised in every media, by every leader, by prominent intellectuals and artists, and in its social democratic form, it is the official creed of our Western societies. But adherence to dogma does not absolve us of intellectual rigor. Freedom and prosperity that we all want for ourselves and for the world do not depend on the system of government, but on respect for individual initiative, private property, and contracts. And such a legal framework characterizes liberalism, classical liberalism, rather than democracy. It is not democracy that guarantees our individual freedom and economic well-being, but liberalism in its classical sense, libertarianism. Citizens do not remain unfree and poor for lack of democracy, but for lack of individual rights, and the electorate in its vagaries is certainly not the best guarantor of human rights. Modern democracy appeared in Western Europe at the same time as mechanization. Mechanization and democracy are the offspring of a great 17th century transformation when science gave up investigating the essence of things to concentrate on their exterior manifestations, its count and all that. Only that which is measurable is knowable according to this paradigm. As a result, those who claimed to know something were required to prove that they had quantified it. This form of science should have limited its purview to material matters. It should have excluded from its field of investigation not only God and beauty and good and evil, but also all human expression that no one would have previously thought to quantify, such as emotion, intelligence, and will. But that would have meant underestimating scientists' ambitions. They could not abandon the study that had been for Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, both the basis and the object of all knowledge. To claim the scientific label, psychologists, sociologists, and economists had to strive to fit the passion of the soul and the creations of the mind into mathematical models. Therefore, 2 centuries ago, science led the theoretical foundations of a materialist society, and this is still the form our modern society takes: industrial, mechanized, and democratic. The government of democratic society is empowered by the will of a people. But how does one measure will? If we are content to add up individual votes at the time of elections as a method of measurement, the process can only have meaning if the opinions expressed refer to homogeneous units. Voting is therefore a production of rigorously standardized homogeneous opinions, much like manufactured components. One set list, or one candidate for an election, a yes or no for a referendum, and this unit is meant to express what you believe. Votes are counted like square meters, with no concern that some represent circles, rectangles, and others triangles. The founding equation of our democracies, one individual, one vote, creates a fiction of a population of electors shaped by the same mode. At the very moment of casting the ballots that give legitimacy to the supreme power in society, the individual is reduced to an arbitrary and interchangeable unit. There is no anthropology of democracy. The citizen has no dimension or quality. And yet evidence shows that some opinions carry more weight than others, not only because they come from wiser and better informed people, but because the stakes of voting are higher for them. In a referendum on school reform, why does my vote as a father with adult children count as much as that of a mother with children of school age? Why should I even vote on that issue? And there are, of course, myriads of organizations where decisions are taken by counting votes. The conclave of Catholic cardinals, committees of non-profit organizations, boards of directors, co-op association meetings. These groups, however, are of a different nature. In most cases, members of these organizations know each other, and they prefer discussion leading to consensus rather than basing their decision on a vote. And these most conservative groups willingly practice the type of face-to-face democracy so dear to anarchists. Such face-to-face democracy is all the more effective that these organizations are structured around a precise goal, and debate only focuses on the means for achieving it. A theatre company exists to perform plays, and firefighters are there to put out fires, and so on. But, what is the goal of a country? What is the purpose of the United Kingdom or of France? To become the most powerful country on the planet, or the greenest, or the most egalitarian? As Hayek pointed out, civil society or a country is not an organization, and you cannot organize it for the purpose of reaching an objective in the future that would be approved by all citizens, except maybe in time of war, but even then, as we are witnessing, we are in time of war in this country. Democracy is therefore based on the simple idea that the people are sovereign. As if the two concepts were mirror images, the disciples of Rousseau replaced the whim of the absolute monarch with the general will of the people. I lived 25 years in Switzerland for my sins, the homeland of Jean-Jacques and a model democracy. And everyday political vocabulary bears the imprint of this passing of power from the monarch to the electorate. Believe it or not, but the newspapers announce a referendum, and they are frequent in Switzerland, with the words, "The sovereign shall decide." And the morning after an election, the paper's headlines read, "The sovereign has decided." In this mirror democracy, democracy reveals its true face. Its goal is not to limit power, but only to appoint those who will exercise power. In countries that were traditionally suspicious of royal prerogatives, like England and the America of the Founding Fathers, Democrats enclose popular power within a strict constitutional framework. But in countries where an opposing force never asserted itself against the monarchy, Democrats saw no reason to erect such a barrier against the electorate. And that is why the French Republic, my republic, experienced an immediate failure in 1792, followed by a succession of crises. The regime was unable to decide between direct democracy and dictatorship by majority rule. And therefore, contrary to true liberalism, democracy does not offer a creative answer to the question of living together. It does not represent a break with the age-old logic of power. Society is based on goals that are supposed to reflect the general will, and because no goal at this level can ever achieve unanimity, Democrats consider it perfectly acceptable to use force against the recalcitrant. Never mind what these goals may be, well, again, whether it is becoming world power, enforcing a religious prohibition, or implementing the latest expert recommendation for saving the environment. The democratic ideology, like modern science, sees itself as wertfrei, devoid of any reference to values. There is nothing in the ideology of democracy that prevents the majority from reintroducing torture in interrogating suspects, from confiscating the property of innocent foreigners, Jews, any minority. The people express their will, and judgment is withheld. How could anyone make a judgment if it were truly the will of the people? Would not criticizing it be like contradicting oneself? The concept of a sovereign people, giving itself its own laws, is not easy to ground logically. No form of power draws legitimacy from it itself, unless you accept that might creates right. The very notion of a social contract assumes the existence of a prior rule, pacta sunt servanda, commitments must be kept. For if one is not certain that the other party will honor its commitments, what sense would there be in entering into a contract? And this prior rule itself must be based on a more fundamental one. Why should commitments be kept? And so on, ad infinitum. And nothing demonstrates more convincingly that legitimacy does not derive from the people than our intellectuals, academics, artists, do-gooders. They are quick to act illegally, especially in France, in the name of higher and often very legitimate principles, hiding asylum seekers, braving official censorship, all whereas their duly elected government formally prohibits it. That is why an adjective linked to the word democracy is necessary to reveal what other ideology serves to regulate popular rage and aberrations. In an Islamic democracy, the sovereign people may vote all they want, on condition that they refrain from challenging Quranic precepts. In a popular democracy, the socialist creed is a frame of reference, just like human rights in so-called liberal democracy. These regulating ideologies, however, do not originate in the ballot box. True heresies of a democratic dogma, they explicitly present themselves as breaks and limits on popular sovereignty. If the people were to free themselves from these constitutional constraints, we would achieve authentic democracy. And that would be the end of our freedom. At this stage, you may say, well, that's fine. Let's have democracy. Let's have free and fair elections. And let's have liberalism too. Human rights, protection of minorities, an independent judiciary, and so on, to control and constrict voters' decisions. Let's have one thing and its opposite. Have our cake and eat it. The left is very good at imagining such wonderful oxymorons. A regulated free market, what Gorbachev called market socialism, and Solzhenitsyn derided as fried snowballs. But where does legitimacy reside in such conflictual constructions? With a judge upholding human rights, or with the majority of the electorate exercising its democratic power and lording over the minority? Rights or democracy? You can't have both. And I believe that the process of civilization is a process of thwarting political power, whoever exercises it. Kings, dictators, religious leaders, or majorities. Since humanity's origins, the temptation has always existed to seize by force that which does not belong to us. Women, slaves, money, territories. Politics does not exist to eliminate that violence, but to legalize it. The only people who suggest making violence against innocent illegal are libertarians. And that is why libertarianism is my parish. Libertarian principles are the most advanced in history, in the evolution of humanity. Politics is content with restraining an all-out war by establishing two classes in society. A class that has the right to practice violence, and a class that is the victim of violence. That is not new. That has existed since the beginning of history. Democracy's innovation in the political order is to allow victims participation in the theatrics of power of a dominant class. Not the reality of power, but in the ritual that institutes it. Democracy, therefore, functions as a collective outlet for the libido dominendi, the thirst for power. And that is the source of its universal success. What indeed is the meaning of casting one's vote other than declaring, this is how I want others to live. This is how I want you to live. This ballot may only account for 1/100,000,000th of the final tally, but it is symbolic. Every child can see in this ritual that he too will have a chance one day to impose his will on his little friends. A continuation of civil war by other means. Democracy cannot avoid using the language of the military. And we hear it every day in the media. Today, candidates conduct a campaign. They fight until they are defeated by their adversary. And they celebrate victory at their headquarters. I myself do not vote. I cannot help but see in the act of voting the desire to exercise power over one's countrymen, which profoundly disturbs me. Democracy draws its psychological sustenance from human beings who are still incapable of conceiving of a society without raw power. Democratic citizens have not moved beyond the slave mentality, and they have only driven out their royal master to replace him with a collective master, the electorate. For us, libertarians, at least for me, the refusal of any power, is a path towards personal emancipation. The only control we desire is self-control. That is why a democratic society is a society of slaves that hide their need for a master, while a libertarian society is a society of masters that have no desire for slaves. This contrast illustrates two divergent manifestations of power: the power of the masses and individual power. To generate the mass effect typical of herds, crowds, armies, democracy must suppress qualitative distinctions, at least nominally. Everybody is in uniform. The citizen has no title, no family, no religious or ethnic roots. Individuals must be indistinguishable from one another to blend into a statistical and impersonal whole, a great level that sets the stage for a materialistic consumer society. Because amongst all distinctions, the one that counts the most in our society is personal wealth, a real obsession of Democrats, because it corresponds to their completely superficial and quantitative view of the world. Even those who write about plutocracy can, in the end, often offer nothing better than different models of distributing wealth. They are prisoners of a materialism of democratic thought. The emancipation of the individual is the other possible manifestation of power. Not the power of the masses, but the power of the mind, the power of creation. Emancipation seeks both material and spiritual prosperity, and a society of personal achievement, responsibility, and wisdom. Democracy is underpinned by two ideologies: nationalism and socialism. And guess what? Both are bankrupt. Socialism is in democracy's DNA. To paraphrase the rallying cry of the American insurgents, there is no representation without taxation. Our great Frédéric Bastiat was clearly referring to the democratic state when he wrote back in 1850 already that the state is a fiction through which everyone hopes to live at the expense of everyone else. When people are asked what they consider most important in their lives, they usually answer love, a fulfilling family life, an interesting job, good health, none of which can be brought to them by politics. Governments cannot deliver happiness. Governments can no longer even mobilize our energies in today's world by means of a great civilizing epic. They have no other function than the forced redistribution of wealth, what I call legalization of theft. The entire propaganda machine of a democratic state must therefore convince voters that money is the only desirable value, because it is the only value the state has to offer. It is understandable, therefore, that those who have money are the object of envy and hatred by those who have little. Now, voters want immediate results. They cannot put their trust in the long term, because a new majority tomorrow might break any political promise made today. Democracy therefore places everyone in the position of a tenant eager to take advantage of the goods rented and unconcerned about investing for the benefit of a following tenant. With socialism, nationalism is the other pillar of democracy. For if the people are sovereign, it is necessary to define who we mean by the people. Democracy, the offspring of mechanization, only works if the people are unified and act uniformly. And when all the efforts at normalization, uniformization fail, and society ends up with citizens with diverse qualities, these citizens must be enclosed into little homogeneous groups in little subsidiary democracies, which is a political form, politically correct form of ethnic cleansing. In Switzerland, the archetype of this constitutional model, these subsidiary democracies are called cantons, each with its own language. Free human beings have no need to be stuck in such political reservations. This tribal practice, however, is the inescapable consequence of democracy. Under other systems, either the people do not control their leaders, which is the case of the old empires and authoritarian regimes, or the leaders do not control the people, as in a libertarian society. In neither case does it make much difference which religious or ethnic group the leaders belong to. However, when the leaders have an allegiance to a part of the population that sees itself as different religiously, ethnically, or culturally, and when institutions grant these leaders the right to intervene in people's lives and in the upbringing of their children, and what language will be taught in school, and what religion will be privileged, then it becomes vital to every citizen that the leaders belong to the same community. Those who belong to an ethnic or religious minority cannot democratically overthrow the majority. They have little opportunity to make themselves heard. What would be the sense of democracy if a minority governed? They must therefore choose a future of resignation, which is characteristic of second-class citizens, or they choose secession. Lebanon, Israel, Yugoslavia, Iraq, the Caucasus, and so many others, India, illustrate the inability of democracy to create conditions in which different communities can live together. The policy of national preference advocated actually both the left and the right, makes democracy totally incompatible with humanity's technological and economic integration. Only 3 countries have an authentic democratic culture. England, literally isolated. Switzerland, protected by mountains. And the United States, beyond the ocean. In those countries, whatever the citizens decided would take effect. The vicissitudes of the world did not derail the application of election platforms. And that is no longer the case. The Swiss do not elect the President of the United States, but he has more influence over their future than does their own Federal Council. And no one votes. No one votes for technological breakthroughs, consumer preferences, stock market prices, economic growth, or a revolution in sexual and social morals. People create these events, but outside the political arena. 2 democratic virtues are commonly heralded, and there I will briefly play the devil's advocate, briefly. The first virtue is that democracy humbles leaders. They must solicit votes from citizens, even when the voters are unconcerned, senile, or illiterate. Remember Coriolanus in Shakespeare's play. Everyone's ballot carried equal weight. It now becomes clear, therefore, why acting and politics have so much in common. Because if a problem is too complicated to explain to the uneducated or unconcerned, the only way to gain their support is to appeal to their emotions. Throughout the world, politicians desperately emulate showbiz celebrities, or showbiz celebrities engage in politics, because they are skilled at creating illusion and manipulating emotions. In his day, Plato was already complaining about theatrocracy, the government by actors. And he was well aware that emotion and passion clouded judgment, and that one of politicians' vulgar and irresistible temptations was to use emotion to paralyze thought, because thinking means resisting. The second virtue of democracy, underscored by Hayek actually, is its educational aspect. The obligation to solicit votes means a politician must report to voters and inform them about his intentions or her intentions. But a political platform covers actions in many different fields. The voter decides on the basis of 2 or 3 positions, even though his votes will help impose all of them on the country, including positions that this voter was indifferent to, or even that went against his convictions. Hayek, however, is right on that count. Democracy is an education. The lesson it teaches is that we can try to get what we want from state violence. Does civilization need this lesson? Democrats retort that this violence is acceptable because in 4 or 5 years' time you can vote out the government that has failed you. But in a few short years, a lot of damage, of irreversible damage, may have been inflicted. And frankly, what sort of society is this that says, hit me now, because I will have my revenge later? Is there no possibility that we grow out of this boarding school playground mentality? All conspirators know that anyone who is aware of the operation must be mixed up in it. Their involvement is a guarantee that they will not denounce the plot and declare themselves innocent. Democracy does not tolerate innocence. If the government embodies the will of the people, how can the people not be responsible for the government's crimes? Even those who voted against the government were colluding with it, are colluding with it, because by playing the game, they have legitimized it. A game of arbitrary legal actions, of police violence, of tax extortion, of military aggression against foreigners, and customs aggression against both citizens and foreigners. For a long time, Serbs, colonized peoples, women, Jews and non-voting minorities could at least declare themselves victims of government's crimes. They had no say, no power. By becoming voting citizens of a state, they became complicit in it. It is impossible to maintain one's moral integrity and to participate at the same time in the legitimization of political power. Anyone who sits at a gambling table has no grounds to complain when things turn out badly. If unsavory politicians, on the right or the left, manage to win elections in Europe, or religious fundamentalists win elections in Europe, Africa, whatever, and recent experience proves it is possible, what can Democrats complain about when they have accepted the election verdict in advance? They also would have imposed their laws if they had won. A gun may be used defensively. A ballot is always an offensive weapon. Instead of this archaic democratic war that only leaves temporary victors and revengeful losers, why can't we be free to live according to our values, whether Islamist, communist, capitalist, or whatever, within communities to which we feel the sense of belonging? Living together requires norms. For us, Libertarian, the universal norm is simple. It is a respect for each human being, their projects, and their possessions. Libertarians do not live on an island forgetful of others. The society we are building, without precedent of this in history, is a society without political power. The ideal is both very modest, because it renounces the great epics of kings and princes and states. And it is very ambitious, because it requires everyone's commitment on a daily basis. It is a society that replaces politics with politeness, citizenship and civic duty with civility. Thank you.